The house at 847 Marshfield Avenue looked like the embodiment of the American dream. Neighbors in this Springfield neighborhood often cited the Carson family as an example of what a real family should look like. Lance Carson woke up every morning at 5:30 a.m., like clockwork. At 45, he was the embodiment of the Midwestern work ethic, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and an invariably serious expression. His construction company, Carson Construction, was thriving, providing his family with a comfortable life and a reputation in the community. Lance was proud to have built his business from the ground up, working 14 hours a day and turning a small crew into one of the most respected construction companies in the county. Carrie got up at 6:30, looking impeccable as always, even right after waking up. At 30, she radiated a special energy that made people turn their heads on the street. Tall, with light hair and piercing gray eyes, she worked as a project coordinator at Miller Media, an advertising agency in the city center. Her colleagues valued her for her creativity and ability to find common ground with even the most difficult clients. Carrie married Lance 3 years ago when Jason was 15, and from the very beginning she tried to become not just a stepmother, but a full-fledged member of the family. Jason Carson was the last to come down for breakfast, which was natural for an 18-year-old freshman engineering student at Springfield Community College. Tall and thin, he had inherited his father's strong build, but retained a youthful awkwardness in his movements. Jason was a quiet young man who preferred books and computer programs to the noisy parties of his peers. His mother, Martha, lived on the other side of town after divorcing Lance 8 years ago, and Jason spent weekends with her by court order. Family breakfasts at the Carson house were the epitome of domestic bliss. Carrie made pancakes or omelets while Lance reviewed construction blueprints at the kitchen table. Jason usually ate in silence, studying textbooks or checking messages on his phone. On the surface, everything looked perfect: a caring wife, a successful husband, an obedient son receiving a good education. However, a careful observer might notice subtle cracks in this facade. Lance rarely looked up from his documents during breakfast, completely absorbed in work issues. His phone rang constantly, and he answered calls even at the table, discussing material deliveries or construction site problems. Carrie would sometimes glance at her husband with irritation, but she said nothing, focusing her attention on Jason instead. Her care for her stepson might have seemed exemplary if one didn't know the details. Carrie always remembered his food preferences, did his laundry, and took an interest in his studies. But there was a special tone to her attention, something beyond ordinary maternal care. She would linger her gaze on Jason a little longer than necessary, casually touch his shoulder when serving breakfast, sit next to him on the couch when they watched TV. At first, Jason took this behavior as his stepmother's natural desire to build a relationship with him. He was grateful for her kindness, especially after the coldness that had reigned in the house since his parents' divorce. Carrie knew how to listen when he talked about his problems at college or his plans for the future. She was the only one in the family who showed interest in his passion for programming, asking questions about the projects he was working on. Cracks in the family idyll began to widen last fall. Lance landed a major contract to build a shopping center on the outskirts of town, which meant an even busier work schedule. He left before dawn and returned late in the evening, often after Jason had gone to bed. His weekends were also busy with meetings with investors, trips to construction sites, and administrative matters. Carrie and Jason were increasingly left home alone together. At first, these evenings were harmless. They watched movies, ordered pizza, played board games. Carrie offered to help Jason with his studies, even though her knowledge of marketing was not very applicable to engineering disciplines. But she knew how to create an atmosphere of trust in which the young man felt understood and accepted. Gradually, their relationship began to change in an almost imperceptible way. Carrie began to appear more often in her home clothes: silk robes, short nightgowns, tight-fitting tops without a bra. She explained this by her desire to feel comfortable in her own home after a busy day at work. Jason tried not to pay attention, but at 18, his body reacted beyond his control. Winter evenings became particularly problematic. Carrie lit the fireplace in the living room and invited Jason to keep her company. They sat on the sofa under a blanket, supposedly to save heat. Carrie would snuggle up to her stepson, explaining that she was cold after working in an air-conditioned office. Her hand would rest on his thigh as she reached for the TV remote. Her breath would tickle his neck as she leaned in to whisper something about what was happening on the screen. Jason knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to stop it. He was grateful to Carrie for her kindness and didn't want to hurt her or destroy the fragile peace in the house. Besides, the physical attraction he was beginning to feel confused him and made him feel guilty. The turning point came in February when Lance left for a week in Chicago to negotiate with potential partners. Carrie suggested that Jason stay home instead of going to his mother's for the weekend. She cited bad weather and the need to prepare for important exams. Jason agreed, unaware that this decision would change his life forever. That Saturday evening, Carrie prepared a special dinner, steaks, which Jason loved, and even allowed him to have a glass of wine. She looked especially beautiful in a red dress that accentuated her figure. After dinner, they sat in front of the fireplace, and Carrie started a conversation about Jason's future, his dreams and plans. She talked about how proud she was of his academic achievements, how he had grown up and become a real man. The alcohol, the warmth of the fireplace, and the closeness of a beautiful woman did their job. When Carrie put her hand on his chest and looked him straight in the eyes, Jason couldn't resist. The first kiss was cautious, almost accidental. The second was quite deliberate. By the end of the evening, the line had been crossed for good. The next morning, Jason woke up feeling deeply guilty and confused. Carrie acted as if nothing had happened, making breakfast and chatting about plans for the day. Only sometimes her gaze lingered on him with particular tenderness, and her touches became slightly more intimate. When Lance returned from his trip, family life outwardly returned to normal. But now there was an invisible bond between Carrie and Jason, full of unspoken words and tension. They exchanged meaningful glances during family dinners, their fingers accidentally touching as they passed dishes to each other. Lance didn't notice anything, completely absorbed in the problems of building the shopping center. His days began at 5 a.m. with calls to contractors and ended late at night studying project documentation. Even at home, he continued to work, turning the second-floor study into a branch of his office. The neighbors still considered the Carson family to be exemplary. Carrie regularly participated in charity events at the local church. Lance sponsored the school baseball team. Jason was getting good grades in college and never got into trouble. On the surface, everything remained perfect. But a careful observer might have noticed changes. Jason had become more withdrawn, often looking pensive and tired. Carrie sometimes seemed nervous, especially when Lance unexpectedly came home earlier than usual. Lance himself was becoming increasingly irritable due to stress at work, although so far this had only manifested itself in brief outbursts of anger on the phone with contractors. Spring brought new complications. The relationship between Carrie and Jason was developing, becoming increasingly risky. They began to meet not only at home, but also in other places, supposedly chance encounters in cafes where Carrie had business meetings, or in shopping malls where Jason bought textbooks. These meetings were short, but full of tension and unspoken words. The secrecy weighed on them both in different ways. Carrie felt guilty towards her husband, but she couldn't stop. In her relationship with Jason, she found the attention and passion that she lacked in her marriage to the always busy Lance. Jason, on the other hand, was torn between feelings of guilt towards his father and his inability to break off his relationship with Carrie. He understood that the situation was wrong, but at the same time, for the first time in his life, he felt desired and special. The morning of May 2025 began as usual for Jason. The alarm clock rang at 7. He took a quick shower and went down to the kitchen, where Carrie was already making breakfast. Lance, as always, was sitting at the table with his phone pressed to his ear, discussing concrete delivery issues with the foreman. Outwardly, everything looked normal, but Jason felt a growing tension that had been building up inside him for months. He and Carrie had been in a relationship for 3 months now, and every day brought new complications. The young man lived in a constant state of anxiety, afraid that his father would suspect something. Every glance from Lance seemed suspicious, every question an attempt to find out the truth. Carrie, on the other hand, was becoming more and more bold, sometimes even demonstratively touching Jason's shoulder or whispering something in his ear in front of her husband. That day, Jason felt particularly unwell. His head was spinning, his throat hurt, and his temperature had risen to 38 degrees. At first, he attributed his illness to stress from upcoming exams and constant emotional tension at home. Carrie suggested that he stay home and rest, but Jason insisted on going to college. He had an important physics lab assignment. By lunchtime, he was feeling so bad that his teacher advised Jason to go to the college health center. The young man reluctantly agreed, hoping to get a sick note and some simple cold medicine. A nurse in a white coat took his temperature and blood pressure and sent him to see a doctor. Dr. Elizabeth Harris had been working at the college health center for 15 years and had seen many students with various ailments. Most cases were trivial: colds, stress, sometimes sexually transmitted diseases, which young people shyly hid. But something about Jason Carson's condition made her suspicious. In addition to a high temperature and general weakness, the young man had enlarged lymph nodes and a characteristic rash on his skin. Dr. Harris asked a few delicate questions about the patient's sex life, to which Jason responded evasively, blushing and avoiding direct eye contact. His embarrassment was understandable. Few young people are willing to openly discuss intimate matters with an unfamiliar doctor. The experienced doctor decided to order a comprehensive examination, including tests for various infections. Jason agreed, thinking that these were standard procedures. He gave blood, received referrals for additional tests, and went home, hoping that in a couple of days he would receive a certificate and be able to return to normal life. The next 3 days passed in agonizing anticipation. His symptoms waxed and waned, but his overall condition remained unstable. Carrie showed ostensible concern, bringing him tea and medicine, but Jason noticed a certain nervousness in her behavior. She often asked what the doctors had said, what tests they had ordered, and when the results would be ready. Lance was hardly ever home, spending his days and evenings at the construction site. Problems with the shopping center were multiplying, deliveries were delayed, conflicts arose with city services, and investors demanded that the work be sped up. When he did come home, he was so exhausted and irritable that he barely noticed his stepson's illness. The call from the medical center came on Friday morning while Jason was eating breakfast alone. Lance had already left for work, and Carrie was showering upstairs. The nurse's voice was professionally neutral, but there was a hint of sympathy in it. She asked him to come to the medical center to discuss the test results with the doctor. The drive to the college seemed endless. Jason tried to convince himself that there was nothing to worry about. At worst, he had some kind of serious infection that could be treated with antibiotics. He thought about his upcoming exams, his summer plans, and getting into college. He was only 18 years old, with his whole life ahead of him, full of possibilities and plans. Dr. Harris's office seemed smaller than when he had first visited. The doctor sat at her desk with a folder in her hands, her face serious and focused. She invited Jason to sit down and remained silent for a while, obviously choosing her words for a difficult conversation. When she uttered the words, HIV infection, Jason's world collapsed. The sounds in the office became muffled, as if he were underwater. Dr. Harris continued to talk about the stages of the disease, modern methods of treatment, and how people with HIV can live full lives with the right therapy. But Jason could hardly hear anything over the noise in his ears and the pounding of his own heart. His first thought was panic. The second was an attempt to find an explanation. He had never had casual relationships, never used drugs, never gotten tattoos in questionable places. The only source of infection could have been Carrie. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The woman he considered a caring stepmother, who became his first lover, had infected him with a deadly disease. Dr. Harris explained that additional tests would be needed to determine the exact time of infection, but judging by the stage of the disease, the infection had occurred relatively recently, within the last few months. The time frame coincided exactly with the beginning of his relationship with Carrie. Jason asked the doctor not to disclose the diagnosis to anyone, citing medical confidentiality. Dr. Harris assured him that the information would remain confidential, but strongly recommended that he see a psychologist and inform his sexual partners of the need for testing. She gave him brochures about HIV infection, contacts for specialized centers, and scheduled a follow-up appointment in a week. Leaving the medical center, Jason felt like he was in a dream. The world around him seemed unreal. Students were rushing to class, laughing, making plans for the weekend, unaware that a man who had just been sentenced was walking beside them. He got into his old Honda and sat in the parking lot for a long time, unable to start the engine. The anger came later, when the initial shock had passed. Carrie knew about her status and didn't tell him. She knowingly put him at risk by engaging in unprotected sex with him. All her talk of love and a special relationship had been a lie. She had used his trust and inexperience to satisfy her own needs, without thinking about the consequences. Jason arrived home around noon. Carrie was working from home, sitting at her laptop in the living room. She looked up when he entered, and a shadow of concern crossed her face. Perhaps she saw something in his eyes that made her wary. Jason walked into the living room and sat down across from her. Carrie closed her laptop and looked intently at her stepson. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. They sat in silence for several minutes, studying each other. "You knew," Jason finally said. His voice sounded hoarse and unfamiliar. Carrie paled but tried to remain calm. "What are you talking about?" "HIV. You knew you were sick when we started what we started." Carrie's face contorted, and she lowered her eyes. The silence lasted an eternity. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but Jason saw fear behind them, not remorse. "Jason, listen." "How long have you known?" He interrupted her. Carrie bit her lip and turned away toward the window. Outside, the bright May sun was shining. Children were playing in the yard of the neighboring house. Life was going on as usual. But in the Carsons' living room, time seemed to have stopped. 2 years? She whispered barely audibly. "I found out a year before I married your father." Jason felt everything inside him break. She knew. All this time she knew and kept quiet. She married his father without telling him the truth. She seduced him, knowing she could infect him. Every kiss, every touch was potentially deadly, and she knew it. "Why?" he asked, and there was so much pain in his voice that Carrie flinched. "I hoped everything would be okay. My viral load was low, I was taking medication, but you weren't sure." "No," she admitted, and the word sounded like a gunshot. Jason stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the familiar landscape, but saw it as if for the first time. His childhood had ended in this house, his youth too. Now there was uncertainty ahead, illness, the need to take medication for the rest of his life, and living with the stigma of being HIV positive. "Does Lance know?" he asked, without turning around. "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Carrie was silent for so long that Jason turned around. She was sitting with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to protect herself from the cold. Her face was deathly pale. "I can't," she finally whispered. "He'll kill me." "Not figuratively. He'll actually kill me if he finds out I infected you." There was a truth in those words that Jason couldn't deny. Lance adored his son and was capable of anything to protect him. Upon learning of his wife's betrayal and that she had condemned Jason to a lifetime of illness, he could lose control. "What am I supposed to do?" Jason asked. "Keep quiet for the rest of my life? Pretend nothing happened?" We could leave, Carrie said suddenly. Together. Start a new life somewhere else. The absurdity of this suggestion struck Jason. The woman who had infected him with a deadly disease was suggesting that he run away with her, abandoning his father and his entire former life. She still did not understand the magnitude of what she had done. "You're crazy," he said quietly. "Jason, please. I love you. What happened between us was real. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. And now I have to live with it." Carrie stood up and tried to approach him, but Jason backed away. Even now, knowing the truth, he felt conflicting emotions toward her. Anger mixed with pain, disgust with remnants of affection. She was the first woman in his life, the person who made him feel grown up and desirable, and she was also the reason for his downfall. "Don't come near me," he said, and there was so much coldness in his voice that Carrie stopped dead in her tracks. They spent the rest of the day in the same house, but avoided each other. Jason locked himself in his room, rereading brochures about HIV infection and trying to comprehend the magnitude of the changes in his life. Carrie sat in the living room, pretending to work, but in reality, just staring at her laptop screen. When Lance returned in the evening, the atmosphere in the house was tense, but he didn't notice. Tired and irritated by problems at the construction site, he ate a quick dinner and locked himself in his office with his documents. Jason didn't come down for dinner, saying he wasn't feeling well. Carrie mechanically reheated the leftovers and ate a few spoonfuls, staring into space. Jason hardly slept that night. He lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future. He had to decide what to do next. Tell his father the truth? That would destroy the family and possibly lead to tragedy. Lance was a man of action, accustomed to solving problems radically. Upon learning of his wife's betrayal, he could do something irreparable. Keep quiet? But how could he live in the same house with the woman who had infected him? How could he look his father in the eye, knowing that he was hiding such a terrible truth from him? How could he explain the need for constant medical supervision and medication? Leave? He didn't have the money to live on his own, and he still had to finish college. Besides, running away would look like an admission of guilt, even though he was the victim, not the perpetrator. Towards morning, Jason made a decision. He would keep quiet, at least for now. He needed time to understand the situation, consult with doctors, and perhaps a psychologist. But his relationship with Carrie was over for good. He would never let her touch him again. When dawn broke, Jason got up and looked in the mirror. An 18-year-old boy with a gaunt face and dull eyes stared back at him. He had aged several years in one night. His childhood and youth were now in the past. Ahead of him lay an adult life, with an illness he had not chosen and a secret that could destroy everything he held dear. Lance Carson had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems. In 20 years of working in construction, he had learned to notice small details that could lead to serious accidents. A crack in the foundation, an incorrectly installed beam, poor quality materials. He saw all of this long before the problems became obvious to others. So the changes in the atmosphere of his own home could not go unnoticed, despite his busy work schedule. Something had been wrong for the past 2 weeks. Jason had become even more withdrawn, hardly ever coming down for dinner, avoiding family conversations. Carrie had changed too. She was nervous about trifles, flinched at loud noises, and constantly checked her phone. At first, Lance attributed this to Jason's exam stress and his wife's busy schedule. But on Wednesday evening, when he came home earlier than usual due to electrical problems at the construction site, he noticed something strange. Carrie and Jason were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, and it was as if there was an invisible wall between them. They weren't looking at each other or talking, and the atmosphere was so tense you could cut it with a knife. When Lance greeted them, they both flinched, as if waking up from a nightmare. Carrie quickly got up and started fussing at the stove. Jason muttered something about homework and disappeared into his room. Lance was left alone in the kitchen, trying to figure out what was going on in his house. The turning point came on Friday evening. Lance was working in his study on the second floor when he heard muffled voices coming from the living room. At first, he didn't pay any attention. Carrie and Jason sometimes discussed his studies or plans for the weekend. But the tone of the conversation seemed strange to him, too tense for a normal conversation. Lance got up from his desk and walked to the office door. The voices were clearer now, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "You can't go on living like this," Carrie said. "Sooner or later, he'll find out anyway." "So what?" Jason replied, and there was such pain in his voice that Lance's heart sank. "What am I going to tell my father? That his wife infected me with HIV? That we slept together while he was at work?" Lance's world collapsed in an instant. His son's words hit him with such force that he grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. HIV. His 18-year-old son had HIV, and he had been infected by Carrie, the woman he trusted, the woman he loved, the woman who was supposed to be taking care of his child. "Jason, please," Carrie continued, and now Lance could hear the desperation in her voice. "We can work something out. Say you got it from someone at college. The doctors will determine when you were infected," Jason replied coldly. "The tests don't lie." Lance closed his eyes and leaned his back against the wall. Thoughts swarmed in his head, each one more painful than the last. Carrie had cheated on him with his own son. She had seduced the 18-year-old boy he had entrusted to her care, and she had infected him with a deadly disease, knowing full well about her diagnosis. The conversation downstairs continued, but Lance was no longer listening. He quietly returned to the table and sat down in a chair, staring at a single point. His hands were shaking, his heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to jump out of his chest. For the first time in many years, he felt helpless. The anger came later, when the initial shock had passed. A rage that Lance had never felt in his life flooded him. He had seen Carrie smile at him in the mornings, make breakfast, talk about work. All this time, she had been lying, hiding the monstrous truth. She hadn't just cheated on him, she had destroyed his son's life. Lance stood up and walked to the window. Outside, it was a normal Friday evening. People were returning from work, children were playing in the yards, life was going on as usual. But his world had changed forever. Jason was sick, and this illness would remain with him for the rest of his life. And the woman who slept in his bed and bore his surname was to blame. The following days were pure torture for Lance. He had to act normal, not showing that he knew the truth. In the morning, he sat down to breakfast with his wife and son, pretended to read documents, and answered Carrie's questions about his plans for the day. But inside, a hurricane of hatred and thirst for revenge raged. Lance began to observe Carrie, noticing details he had previously ignored. How she nervously twirled her hair when Jason entered the room. How she avoided his gaze during conversations. How she flinched when Lance unexpectedly appeared at home. She knew she was playing with fire, but she continued her game, hoping that the truth would never come out. On Saturday evening, when Jason left to spend the weekend with his mother, Lance stayed home with Carrie. She suggested watching a movie, ordering pizza, and spending a romantic evening together. Lance agreed, forcing a smile through gritted teeth. He sat next to her on the couch, feeling disgust at her every touch. Carrie, unaware of his knowledge, tried to restore intimacy in their relationship. She snuggled up to her husband, rested her head on his shoulder, and talked about work and vacation plans. Lance listened and thought about how those same hands had touched his son. Those same lips had kissed Jason while he was working to provide for his family. Sunday morning brought a new challenge. Carrie suggested they visit her parents' cottage in a neighboring county. She wanted to present Lance as a caring husband and model family man. The irony of the situation was so painful that Lance could barely contain himself. All the way there, Carrie chattered about trivial things, made plans for the summer, and discussed the possibility of buying a new car. Lance drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, he could see his face, haggard, with dull eyes. In a few days, he had aged years. Carrie's parents welcomed them warmly. Her father asked about the construction business, and her mother praised her daughter for her successful marriage. Lance smiled, answered questions, and played the role of the happy husband. But inside, a decision was maturing, becoming clearer with each passing hour. The return trip was silent. Carrie fell asleep in the passenger seat, while Lance thought about what to do with the woman who had destroyed his family. Forgive her? Impossible. Divorce her? That wouldn't solve the problem of Jason's illness or punish the guilty party for what she had done. Go to the police? Legally, Carrie had committed no crime. The intimacy was consensual, and intentional HIV infection is difficult to prove. There was only one option left: vigilante justice. Lance understood that this idea contradicted everything he had believed in before. He had never been prone to violence, always resolving conflicts through negotiation. But what Carrie had done went beyond the bounds of normal human relations. She had not simply betrayed his trust, she had condemned his son to a lifetime of suffering. Monday brought another shock. Lance decided to discreetly follow Carrie to see if she had any other secrets. He canceled a meeting with contractors and parked near her agency's office. Half an hour later, Carrie left the building not alone, but in the company of a young man of about 25. Lance couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke for itself. The young man was clearly courting Carrie, and she wasn't rejecting his attention. They went into a nearby cafe and sat down at a table by the window. Carrie laughed, coquettishly adjusted her hair, and put her hand on her companion's shoulder. So Jason wasn't the only one. Carrie continued her games, possibly putting other men at risk of infection. Lance sat in his car, watching his wife, and felt the last remnants of his love and respect for her turn into burning hatred. That evening, a fateful argument broke out. Lance came home earlier than usual and found Carrie on the phone. She was speaking quietly, almost in a whisper, but he managed to catch a few phrases. Tomorrow evening. He won't find out. It's our secret. When she saw her husband, Carrie quickly ended the conversation and tried to pretend she was talking to a friend about work. "Who were you talking to?" Lance asked, and there was a note in his voice that Carrie had never heard before. "Jennifer from marketing," she replied without looking up. "We were discussing the new advertising campaign." "You're lying," Lance said quietly, but with such conviction that Carrie flinched. She looked up and, for the first time in several days, looked her husband straight in the eye. What she saw made her pale. There was no trace of the usual fatigue or irritation in Lance's eyes. There was the cold, waiting fury of a predator ready to pounce on its prey. "Lance, what's going on with you?" She tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "You've been acting strange these last few days." "I know," he said, and those two words sounded like a sentence. Carrie took a step back, instinctively sensing danger. "What do you know?" "Everything. About Jason. About the illness. About what you did to him." Carrie's face turned deathly pale. She realized that the game was over, the masks had been dropped, and pretense was no longer possible. Lance knew the truth, and judging by his expression, forgiveness was not to be expected. "Lance, let me explain." "Explain what?" His voice grew quieter, which was much scarier than shouting. "How did you seduce my son? How did you infect him with a deadly disease? How did you lie to my face every day?" Carrie tried to approach her husband, but he recoiled sharply, as if her touch could burn him. "Don't you dare come near me," he hissed. "You're no longer my wife. You're nobody. You're worse than nobody. Lance, please, let's talk like adults." "Yes, I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Lance raised his voice for the first time in the entire conversation. "You call that a mistake? You ruined my son's life." Carrie began to cry, but her tears only intensified his rage. He saw them not as remorse, but as an attempt to play on his emotions, to make him forgive the unforgivable. "Get out of my house," he said. "Today. And never show your face near my family again. Lance, this is our home. We can work this out civilized." "Civilized?" He laughed, but the laughter was more frightening than any threat. "After what you've done, you talk about civility." Carrie realized that negotiation was useless. She saw such hatred in her husband's eyes that it frightened her. Lance had always been a calm person, but now something primitive and dangerous had awakened in him. "Fine," she said, wiping away her tears. "I'll leave. But first I need to pack my things." "You have an hour," Lance replied. "Then I'll call the police." Carrie nodded and headed for the stairs. Halfway up, she turned around. "Lance, I really loved you. And Jason, too." "That kind of love is worse than hate," he replied without looking up. An hour later, Carrie left the house on Marshfield Avenue for good. Lance watched from the window as she got into her car and drove away into the night. But the rage in his heart did not subside. On the contrary, it grew, feeding on thoughts of his son, his ruined future, and the illness that would remain with him forever. Carrie thought that being kicked out of the house was the end of the story. But she was wrong. For Lance, it was only the beginning. The industrial landfill on the eastern outskirts of Springfield operated around the clock, accepting waste from the entire city and surrounding areas. This place was rarely visited by ordinary citizens. Only garbage trucks, utility workers, and occasionally homeless people looking for something valuable among the piles of rubbish came here. High barbed wire fences and warning signs were meant to deter casual visitors, but security was minimal at night. Tuesday, May 27, 2025, began as a normal workday for Roy McDaniels, a bulldozer operator who had been working at the city landfill for 15 years. At 52, he was a strong man with rough hands and a philosophical outlook on life. Roy had seen it all in his career, from discarded newborn kittens to expensive items that rich people threw away after divorces. At 6:30 in the morning, Roy started his bulldozer and began his usual routine of leveling and compacting the trash that had accumulated overnight. The bright May sun was shining, and the air was already beginning to fill with the characteristic smell of decomposing waste. Roy turned on the radio in the cab and set to work, mentally planning his evening. His wife had promised to make his favorite casserole. After about an hour of work, as the bulldozer was leveling another pile of household waste near the far edge of the dump, Roy noticed something unusual. Among the plastic bags and construction debris, he could see something that looked like clothing. At first, he thought someone had thrown away some old clothes, but something about the shape of the object made him stop the machine. Roy turned off the engine and climbed out of the cab. As he got closer, he realized that his worst fears had been confirmed. Among the trash lay the body of a young woman. She was wearing a blue dress that had once been elegant but was now torn and stained. Her blonde hair was tousled and tangled, her face turned toward the ground. Roy took out his phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. In all his years working at the landfill, he had found many unpleasant things, but he had never before stumbled upon a human body. The dispatcher's voice seemed like a lifeline in this nightmare. The police arrived 12 minutes later. The first to arrive at the scene was Patrol Officer Mike Thompson, a young cop with 3 years of experience. Upon seeing the body, he immediately called for backup and forensics and cordoned off the scene with yellow tape. Roy sat in the cab of his bulldozer, sipping coffee from a thermos and trying to calm his nerves. Detective Sam Rodriguez received a call at 8 in the morning while having breakfast at home with his wife, Maria. At 42, he was one of the most experienced investigators in the Springfield Police Department's Major Crimes Division. In 15 years of service, he had investigated over 100 murders, and his clearance rate was an impressive 87%. Rodriguez arrived at the dump at 8:30. The scene had already been cordoned off, and forensic technicians were working, taking photographs and collecting evidence. Coroner Dr. Helen Wilson was examining the body making preliminary conclusions about the cause of death. The body lay in an unnatural position among construction debris and household waste. The woman was of medium height, slim build, and appeared to be about 30 years old. She was wearing a good quality blue cocktail dress, high-heeled shoes, and gold earrings. The expensive clothes and jewelry contrasted with the squalid place where the body was found. "What can you tell us, Doc?" Rodriguez asked, approaching the coroner. Dr. Wilson was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and piercing eyes. She had been a pathologist for 20 years and had seen all kinds of ways people could take each other's lives. "Preliminary findings indicate strangulation," she replied, without taking her eyes off the body. "See these marks on the neck? It looks like strangulation by hands, but I can only determine the exact cause of death after the autopsy." Rodriguez examined the scene where the body had been found. The woman was lying face down, her arms spread out to the sides. A woman's handbag lay nearby, its contents scattered on the ground. The forensic technician was already packing various items into bags: lipstick, keys, a cell phone. "Any ID?" asked the detective. "Driver's license in the name of Carrie Ann Carson," replied Sergeant Davis, the forensic investigator. "Address: 847 Marshfield Avenue. 30 years old. Organ donor Rodriguez wrote the information down in his notebook. The address was in a respectable neighborhood, which made the appearance of the victim's body in the dump even more mysterious. People from such neighborhoods rarely ended their lives among the trash. "Time of death?" the detective continued to ask. "Judging by the condition of the body and the temperature, death occurred late in the evening or at night," Dr. Wilson replied. "I'll be more precise after the autopsy, but preliminarily between 10 p.m. yesterday and 2 a.m. today." Rodriguez walked around the scene, studying the surroundings. The landfill was located in an industrial area, far from residential areas. The nearest buildings, warehouses, and small factories were several hundred meters away. It was the perfect place to dispose of a body without attracting attention. Access to the landfill was controlled, but at night, security was minimal. There was one guard at the gate, who spent most of his time in the booth watching TV or dozing. There were CCTV cameras only at the entrance, and the landfill area was too large to be fully monitored. Rodriguez approached Roy McDaniels, who was still sitting in the bulldozer cab. "Tell me in detail how you found the body," the detective asked. Roy was upset, but tried to answer clearly and to the point. He described his usual morning routine and how he noticed something suspicious among the trash. The man emphasized that he had not touched the body and had immediately called the police. "Did you see any strangers on the dump site yesterday evening or last night?" Rodriguez asked. "No, I went home at 6 in the evening. The night shift is Bob Harrison, but he only works at the gate." Rodriguez wrote down the night guard's name and decided to question him later. So far, the picture was typical for such crimes: murder in another place and dumping the body at a landfill in the hope that it would not be found, or would not be found soon. By 10 in the morning, the preliminary examination of the scene was complete. The body was sent to the morgue for an autopsy, and the evidence was sent to the crime lab. Rodriguez drove to the address listed on the victim's driver's license to notify the family of the tragedy and conduct initial interviews. The house on Marshfield Avenue was, indeed, in a nice neighborhood. The two-story colonial-style building with a well-kept lawn spoke of the owner's affluence. Rodriguez parked at the curb and walked to the front door. The door was opened by a middle-aged man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a tired face. He was wearing work clothes, his hands stained with paint or cement. "Lance Carson?" asked the detective, showing his badge. "Yes, that's me. What's the matter?" "Detective Rodriguez, Springfield Police." "May I come in? It's about your wife." Carrie Lance's face became serious, but Rodriguez did not see the fear or surprise that people usually showed when they received bad news about their loved ones. "Come in," Lance said, stepping aside. They walked into the living room, which looked cozy and expensively furnished. Lance offered the detective a seat but remained standing by the window. "Mr. Carson, I need to inform you that your wife's body was found this morning. She is dead." Lance was silent for a few seconds, staring out the window. Then he slowly turned to the detective. "Where was she found?" "At the city dump. The preliminary cause of death is suffocation." Rodriguez watched the victim's husband's reaction closely. Lance looked shocked, but somehow restrained. There were no tears, no hysterics, no attempts to find out details. "When did you last see your wife?" the detective asked. "On Monday evening. We had an argument, and she left the house." "What was the argument about?" Lance paused, obviously searching for words. "Family problems. I found out she was cheating on me." Rodriguez wrote the answer in his notebook. Infidelity was one of the most common motives for spousal murder. "Where did she go after the argument?" "I don't know. She said she would stay with a friend until we decided what to do next." "What was the friend's name?" "She didn't say. Carrie has a lot of friends from work." At that moment, a young man of about 18 entered the house, tall, thin, with an anxious expression on his face. "This is my son, Jason," Lance explained. "Jason, this is Detective Rodriguez. He told me that Carrie is dead." Jason turned pale and sank into a chair. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "She was murdered," his father replied curtly. Rodriguez watched the young man's reaction. Jason looked genuinely shocked, but the detective saw something else in his eyes. Perhaps relief or fear. "Mr. Carson Jr., when was the last time you saw Carrie?" Jason glanced quickly at his father before answering. "On Monday at dinner. Then I went to my room to do my homework." "Did you hear the argument between your father and stepmother?" "I could hear voices coming from the living room, but I wasn't listening on purpose." Rodriguez felt that both men were hiding something. Their answers were too brief, and their behavior was unnaturally restrained for people who had just learned of the death of a loved one. "Mr. Carson, where were you last night between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? "At home. I watched TV, then went to bed." "Can anyone confirm that?" "Jason, he was home too." The detective turned to the young man. "Is that true?" "Yes. My father was home all evening." Rodriguez made a few more notes in his notebook. So far, he had no reason to suspect any of the family members, but his intuition told him that something wasn't right. "Do you know if Carrie had any enemies? People who might have wanted to harm her?" Lance shook his head. "She worked at an advertising agency. She only had business contacts. As far as I know, she didn't have any serious conflicts with anyone." "What about the man she was having an affair with?" "I don't know who that was. I only found out about the affair on Monday." Rodriguez left his business card and asked them to contact him if they remembered anything important. As he left the house, he looked back and saw the father and son standing at the window, watching him drive away. The detective's next stop was the Miller Media Advertising Agency, where the victim worked. The office was located on the 4th floor of a modern building in the city center. The receptionist was clearly upset by the news of her colleague's death. The agency's director, David Miller, received the detective in his office. He was a man in his 50s with a neat beard and an expensive suit. "Carrie was one of our best employees," he said. "Clients loved her. Colleagues respected her. I can't imagine who would want to harm her. Did she have a romantic relationship with any of her colleagues?" Miller paused before answering. "Well, lately she's been spending a lot of time with Brad Thomas from the creative department. He's a talented young guy, but I don't know if there was anything serious between them." Rodriguez wrote down the name and asked to arrange a meeting with Brad Thomas. The young man turned out to be an attractive blonde in his mid-20s who was clearly nervous during the conversation. "Yes, we were dating," Brad admitted, "but it was nothing serious, just friends." "When was the last time you saw Carrie?" "On Monday at the office. She seemed upset and said she was having problems at home." "Did you see her after work on Monday?" Brad blushed and shook his head. "No, she said she would be busy that evening." Rodriguez felt that the young man was not telling the whole truth, but he could not prove it yet. The autopsy results came in on the third day of the investigation. Dr. Wilson met Detective Rodriguez at the morgue with a thick folder in her hands and a serious expression on her face. The cause of death is mechanical asphyxiation as a result of compression of the neck with hands, she began her report. Time of death is between 11 p.m. on Monday and 1 a.m. on Tuesday. But there is something interesting. Rodriguez looked up from his notebook. The victim was HIV positive. Based on the tests, the disease was in an advanced stage. She knew about her diagnosis and was receiving antiretroviral therapy. The detective frowned. The victim's HIV status could significantly change the picture of the crime. Any signs of a struggle? Minimal. Minor scratches on her hands, a bruise on her shoulder. It looks like the struggle was brief. The killer acted decisively. Rodriguez thanked the pathologist and returned to the station. The new information forced him to reconsider his theories. If Carrie was HIV positive and had been hiding it from her husband, the motive for the murder became clearer. The next day, the detective decided to question the Carson family again. He arrived at the house on Marshfield Avenue around noon and found Lance in the garage, repairing the lawnmower. The man looked tired, but calm. "Mr. Carson, I need to ask you a few more questions." Lance wiped his hands with a rag and nodded. "Did you know your wife was HIV positive?" Lance's face didn't change, but his hands tensed slightly. "Yes, I knew." "When did you find out?" "On Monday. The same day I found out about the affair." Rodriguez wrote down the answer. But something about Lance's behavior alarmed him. "How did you find out?" Lance hesitated before answering. "I overheard a conversation. Carrie was talking to Jason about medical issues. Can I talk to your son? He's in college." Taking exams, Rodriguez decided to check this information. A call to the college confirmed that Jason Carson was indeed taking a physics exam at the specified time. However, a more detailed examination of Lance's alibi revealed inconsistencies. A neighbor recalled seeing Lance's car leaving the garage late on Monday evening, around 11 p.m. Lance claimed he had been at home all evening. Another clue emerged when analyzing CCTV footage. A camera at a gas station 2 miles from the dump recorded a pickup truck similar to Lance's car at 11:47 p.m. on Monday. The quality of the recording was insufficient for accurate identification, but the model and color matched. Rodriguez decided to apply psychological pressure. He summoned Lance to the station for further questioning. "Mr. Carson, we have a witness who saw you leaving your home on Monday evening." Lance sat in the interrogation room with his hands folded on the table. He still looked calm. Maybe the neighbor was mistaken. "What about the camera at the gas station?" "Your car was spotted near the dump on the night of the murder." For the first time during the interrogations, something resembling concern flashed in Lance's eyes. "Detective, I understand that you need to find the killer, but I didn't kill Carrie." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and studied the suspect's face intently. "Mr. Carson, I've been investigating murders for 15 years. I've seen many people in your position. There are usually 2 reasons why a husband kills his wife: money or betrayal. You didn't have financial problems, so it must have been betrayal." Lance was silent. "But it wasn't just ordinary betrayal, was it? Carrie didn't just cheat on you. She infected your son with a deadly disease." Lance's face contorted with pain, and the detective knew he had hit the mark. "Jason is HIV positive too, isn't he? That's why you overheard their conversation. That's the real reason you killed Carrie." Lance covered his face with his hands and remained silent for a long time. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "He's 18, he whispered. "He has his whole life ahead of him. She destroyed his future." "Tell me what happened on Monday night." Lance took a deep breath and began his story. "I called her around 11. I said I wanted to talk, to pick up her things. She agreed to meet me in the parking lot of the mall. She thought we were going to discuss the divorce." Rodriguez turned on the tape recorder. "Go on." When I arrived, she was sitting in her car. I walked over, and we talked. I asked her how she could do that to my son. She started making excuses, saying she didn't mean to hurt him. Lance paused, gathering his thoughts. And then she said that Jason seduced her, that he was an adult and made his own decisions, that she wasn't to blame for what happened. The detective saw Lance's hands clench into fists. I don't remember how it started. I only remember grabbing her by the throat. She tried to break free, scratching me, but I was stronger. I could only think of one thing: she killed my boy. Not physically, but morally, spiritually. She stole his future. What did you do next? I realized she was dead. I was scared. I knew I would be arrested, and Jason would be left alone. I decided to hide the body. Lance recounted how he carried Carrie's body to his pickup truck, drove to a landfill, and dumped it among the trash. He hoped that the body would not be found soon, or not at all. I didn't plan to kill her, he concluded. I just couldn't control my anger when she blamed Jason. Rodriguez turned off the tape recorder. Lance Carson was arrested on charges of first-degree murder. The trial took place 6 months later. The jury heard testimony from witnesses, experts, and the defendant himself. Lance's lawyer tried to get the charge reduced to manslaughter, citing emotional stress and the victim's provocative behavior. The prosecutor insisted on the maximum punishment, arguing that Lance had acted in cold blood and then tried to cover up the traces of the crime. Jason was present in the courtroom, having changed beyond recognition over the past few months. The young man had lost weight, looked haggard, and his eyes revealed deep sorrow. Sitting next to him was his biological mother, Martha, who had taken care of her son after his father's arrest. The jury returned a guilty verdict on the charge of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced Lance Carson to 25 years in prison. Leaving the courtroom, Jason cried for the first time in 6 months. He had lost not only his stepmother, who, despite everything, had been an important part of his life, but also his father, who had tried to protect him in the only way he knew how. Martha took her son in and tried to help him start a new life. Jason continued his studies, took his medication regularly, and saw a psychotherapist. Gradually, he began to recover, but the trauma of what had happened would remain with him forever. The house on Marshfield Avenue was sold. The money went to pay for Jason's lawyer and medical expenses. Lance's construction company went bankrupt without its leader. A year after the trial, Jason enrolled in a university in another state, deciding to start his life with a clean slate. He changed his last name to his mother's, Collins, and told no one about the tragedy in his family. Martha often wondered if things could have turned out differently. If Carrie had been honest from the start, if Lance had gone to the police instead of taking justice into his own hands, if Jason had told the truth right away, but history has no subjunctive mood. Lance worked in prison. The Carson family's story became a cautionary tale for many in Springfield. It showed that family secrets are destructive, that lies breed tragedy, and that sometimes trying to protect loved ones can lead to even greater grief. Jason survived and was able to build a new life, but the scars from this tragedy remained in his soul forever. He learned to live with his diagnosis, found a job, and made friends who accepted him for who he was. But every day he remembered the price his family paid for secrets and lies.